Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most unbelievable air battles in history, how outdated MiG-21s and a young Vietnamese pilot managed to outsmart and take down some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. It's a story of strategy, surprise, and a war that didn't go the way anyone expected. Don't forget to hit like and drop a comment with your thoughts. Now, let's get started. December 2nd, 1967. The sky above Hanoi did not look like a battlefield. It looked quiet, almost untouched. But hidden behind the clouds was one of the most uneven air wars ever fought. On one side, the United States Air Force deployed its pride. The F-4 Phantom, a machine built with cutting-edge radar, supersonic speed, and missiles designed to destroy enemies before they were even seen. Each aircraft represented not only advanced engineering, but also years of training, resources, and confidence in technological superiority. On the other side were the MiG-21s of North Vietnam, smaller, cheaper, and far less sophisticated. Their radar was basic, their weapons limited, and their pilots had only a fraction of the flight hours compared to their American counterparts. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable. This was not supposed to be a contest, but a demonstration of overwhelming power. Yet, something didn't add up. Despite every measurable advantage, American aircraft were being lost in the skies over Hanoi. Not in large, drawn-out battles, but in sudden, confusing moments that seemed to come out of nowhere. Encounters were brief, chaotic, and often over before they could even be understood. There were no clear patterns, no easy explanations, only a growing sense that the war in the air was not unfolding the way it was supposed to. What puzzled American commanders was not just the losses, but the way they were happening. The F-4 Phantom had been designed for a different kind of war, one fought at long distances where radar would detect the enemy first, and missiles would end the fight before it truly began. In theory, American pilots should have seen every threat coming. In reality, they often saw nothing at all. The skies over North Vietnam did not behave like the clean, predictable environment their systems were built for. Thick cloud layers, dense humidity, and the complex terrain below interfered with radar signals, creating blind spots that technology could not overcome. Aircraft flying low blended into what pilots called ground clutter, becoming almost invisible until it was too late. The advantage that once seemed absolute began to fade in these conditions. Then came the most dangerous shift of all. Combat moved closer. Encounters no longer started at long range, but unfolded in tight, sudden bursts at close distance. In these moments, speed and missiles mattered less than awareness and positioning. The F-4, built without an internal gun, found itself struggling in a type of dogfight its designers believed would never happen again. What was meant to be a controlled, high-tech engagement had turned into something far more unpredictable. And in that chaos, the balance of power began to quietly, but decisively, change. And at the center of this shifting balance was a young pilot whose story seemed to defy every expectation. Nguyen Van Coc was not born into a world of machines or military strategy. He was the son of a rice farmer, raised in a rural landscape where the rhythm of life was shaped by seasons, not engines. Airplanes were distant, almost abstract symbols of a world far beyond his reach. Yet within a few years, that same world would place him in the cockpit of a supersonic fighter, facing some of the most advanced aircraft ever built. In 1963, when North Vietnam began recruiting for its air force, he volunteered not out of ideology, but curiosity, even ambition. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a small group was selected, and he was among them. Soon after, he was sent thousands of kilometers away to the Soviet Union, where he would undergo intense and unforgiving training. The MiG-21 was fast, powerful, and dangerously demanding. It offered little room for error. Every maneuver had to be precise, every decision immediate. There was no space for hesitation. Compared to American pilots, who often arrived in Vietnam with hundreds of flight hours, Nguyen Van Coc's experience was limited. But what he lacked in time, he began to replace with discipline and clarity. The training he received emphasized something simple but critical. Survival depended not on prolonged combat, but on speed, surprise, and control. You were not meant to dominate the sky, you were meant to appear, strike, and vanish. By the time he returned to Vietnam, he carried more than just technical skill. He carried a mindset shaped by necessity, one that aligned perfectly with the changing nature of the war. As the skies grew more unpredictable and traditional advantages began to fail, pilots like Nguyen Van Coc were not at a disadvantage. They were exactly what this new kind of conflict demanded. What emerged next was not a new aircraft or a technological breakthrough, but something far more difficult to detect: an idea. The North Vietnamese Air Force began to shape a method of fighting that turned weakness into advantage. Instead of challenging American aircraft head-on, they would avoid the kind of battle the enemy was prepared for. Every engagement would be brief, calculated, and almost invisible until the final moment. The principle was simple: strike fast and disappear even faster. MiG-21 pilots would take off and immediately descend to low altitude, often just a few hundred meters above the ground. At that height, they blended into the landscape, becoming nearly indistinguishable from terrain on enemy radar. Their own radar systems remained off, keeping them silent. To American pilots scanning their instruments, the sky appeared clear. But it wasn't. Guided by ground control stations, the MiGs were carefully positioned without ever revealing themselves. Controllers tracked American formations from a distance and relayed precise instructions: direction, altitude, timing. The pilots in the air did not search for the enemy. They were guided directly to it. And then, at exactly the right moment, everything changed. From below the American formation, where visibility was weakest, the MiGs would suddenly climb. Engines roaring at full power, they burst upward through cloud cover or haze, appearing in the blind spot of the F-4S. The distance was already dangerously close. There was no time for long-range targeting, no time for complex maneuvering. Within seconds, a lock was achieved. A missile fired. And then, just as quickly, they were gone. The MiGs did not stay to fight. They did not circle, did not pursue, did not confirm the outcome. Instead, they immediately cut speed, rolled away, and dived back into the clouds or down toward low altitude, where radar once again lost them. The entire encounter could last less than a minute, too fast for coordination, too sudden for a proper response. By the time American pilots understood what had happened, the attackers had already vanished. To those on the receiving end, it felt less like a battle and more like an ambush without warning. There were no clear entry points, no predictable patterns, just brief flashes of contact, followed by silence. And within that silence, uncertainty began to grow. Behind those sudden appearances and disappearances was something even more decisive: an unseen network that turned scattered pilots into a coordinated force. While the MiG-21s remained hidden at low altitude, a chain of radar stations stretched across North Vietnam was constantly watching the sky. From the moment American aircraft crossed into hostile airspace, they were no longer moving unnoticed. Every change in direction, every shift in altitude, was tracked and relayed in real time. At the center of this system was a ground command network that functioned with quiet precision. Information flowed from early warning stations to a central control point, where decisions were made not in seconds, but in anticipation. This was where the real battle began, not in the air, but on the ground. Instead of relying on individual pilots to search, interpret, and react, the system removed uncertainty. Each MiG pilot became part of a larger design, guided step by step toward a carefully chosen moment of contact. Instructions were clear and minimal: maintain altitude, hold position, adjust heading, wait. The pilots saw only fragments of the situation through their cockpit windows, but the controllers saw everything. They knew where the American formations were strongest, where they were distracted, and where their defenses were weakest. Timing was everything. Launch too early, and the element of surprise would be lost. Wait too long, and the opportunity would disappear. When the order finally came, it was never random. It was the result of continuous observation and calculation. The MiGs were directed into positions where the enemy least expected them: below, behind, or concealed by clouds. In that moment, what seemed like a chaotic ambush was actually the final step of a carefully orchestrated sequence. To American pilots, the attacks felt unpredictable, almost impossible to anticipate, but in reality, they were being watched long before they ever sensed danger. The sky over North Vietnam was not empty, it was controlled. But as this invisible network tightened its grip on the battlefield, another truth began to surface, one that had been built into the design of the American aircraft itself. The F-4 Phantom was a product of a different vision of war, a future where technology would eliminate uncertainty. Its strength lay in detection and distance, powerful radar to see first, and long-range missiles to strike before the enemy could respond. In that world, close combat was no longer necessary. Yet over North Vietnam, that vision began to unravel. The environment itself, cloud cover, terrain, and low-altitude flight, reduced the effectiveness of radar, turning one of the Phantom's greatest advantages into a limited tool. Targets appeared too late, or not at all. And when they did, the window to act was often measured in seconds, not minutes. More critically, the aircraft carried a hidden vulnerability. It had no internal gun. Designers had believed missiles would make traditional dogfighting obsolete, but in these sudden, close-range encounters, missiles struggled. They required time to lock on, distance to track, and stable conditions to guide accurately conditions that simply did not exist in an ambush. When a MiG appeared within visual range, maneuvering sharply and disappearing just as quickly, that system faltered. American pilots found themselves in a situation they had not been prepared for. Highly trained, flying advanced machines, yet forced into engagements where their primary weapons were difficult to use. The closer the fight became, the more the balance shifted. In the tight, unpredictable space of a dogfight, technology alone was no longer enough. It was only a matter of time before this imbalance was tested in real combat, and when it was, the results were both sudden and unsettling. The early ambushes carried out by MiG-21 pilots were not large, dramatic battles, but brief encounters that unfolded with almost surgical precision. There were no long chases, no drawn-out dogfights, just moments measured in seconds where everything happened at once. American strike formations would move steadily toward their targets, confident in their radar coverage and escort patterns. The skies appeared clear. Then, without warning, contact. A MiG would emerge from below or break through a layer of cloud at close range, already in position. Before pilots could fully process what they were seeing, a missile would be in the air. In many cases, there was no time to react effectively. Evasive maneuvers came too late, radar warnings arrived too late, and communication within the formation lagged behind the speed of the attack. The MiGs did not stay to confirm the result. They fired, broke away instantly, and vanished back into the same environment that had concealed them. By the time American pilots attempted to pursue, there was nothing left to chase. What made these encounters even more disorienting was their consistency. This was not a one-time surprise, it was happening again and again. The pattern was clear to those experiencing it, but difficult to counter in practice. Each successful ambush reinforced the effectiveness of the tactic, proving that even a small window of opportunity, if used perfectly, was enough to shift the outcome. For the MiG pilots, these early engagements were more than victories, they were confirmation. The strategy worked. Speed, timing, and surprise could overcome superior technology, as long as the fight remained on their terms. And with each encounter, confidence grew not just in the aircraft, but in the method itself. But the pattern did not go unnoticed. Each sudden loss, each vanishing contact, forced American commanders to look beyond technology and begin studying behavior. If the MiGs would not fight on expected terms, then perhaps the answer was not to chase them, but to make them come. What followed was not just a counterattack, but a carefully constructed deception. The plan would later be known as Operation Bolo. Its brilliance did not lie in firepower, but in imitation. American F-4 Phantom pilots would disguise themselves as something else entirely slow, heavily loaded strike aircraft that the North Vietnamese had learned to target. They would fly the same routes, maintain the same altitudes, even mimic the same radio patterns. On radar, they would appear vulnerable, predictable, exactly the kind of target the MiGs had been trained to ambush. From the ground, the illusion worked. North Vietnamese radar operators detected what looked like a routine bombing formation entering their airspace. The response was immediate and familiar. Scramble the MiGs, guide them into position, prepare for another swift strike. Everything unfolded as it had before until the final moment. As the MiG-21s climbed to engage, expecting to find distracted bombers, they instead entered a sky that was already waiting for them. The American formation held altitude, speed, and formation discipline, but this time, they were not reacting, they were ready. The advantage of surprise had been reversed. What followed was fast, decisive, and one-sided. Instead of a brief ambush, the encounter expanded into a sustained engagement. American pilots, now fully alert and positioned for combat, locked onto their targets at medium range. Missiles launched, not in panic, but with control. The MiGs, caught in a situation they had not anticipated, attempted to disengage using the same tactics that had worked before, diving, scattering, disappearing into clouds. But the sky was no longer empty. There were too many phantoms, covering too much space. Within minutes, the balance shifted dramatically. Aircraft that had once appeared and vanished without consequence were now being tracked, pursued, and destroyed. The very predictability of the ambush tactic, its reliance on expected patterns, had become its weakness. By the end of the engagement, multiple MiG-21s had been shot down, while American forces suffered no losses. It was one of the most successful air-to-air operations of the war, not because of superior machines, but because of a shift in thinking. The Americans had not simply countered the tactic, they had stepped inside it, understood it, and turned it against its creators. For a moment, it seemed as though the mystery had been solved. The invisible threat had been exposed, and the skies over North Vietnam had been reclaimed. But war rarely ends with a single answer, and this was only the beginning of another adaptation. But the outcome of Operation Bolo did not end the story, it forced it to evolve. The losses were real, and the message was clear. The old pattern could no longer be repeated without consequence. For the North Vietnamese Air Force, survival now depended on something more than speed and surprise. It required restraint. In the weeks that followed, the skies grew quieter. MiG formations no longer launched at every opportunity, and the once frequent ambushes became rare. This was not hesitation, it was calculation. Pilots and ground controllers began to reassess every detail of their approach, studying where the deception had worked and where their own assumptions had failed. The lesson was difficult, but undeniable. Even a successful tactic could become predictable. From that point on, engagements were chosen with far greater care. MiGs would wait longer before taking off, sometimes allowing entire American formations to pass without response. They avoided large-scale confrontations and focused instead on moments when the enemy was most exposed, when formations were stretched, when attention was divided, or when conditions once again favored concealment. The principle remained the same, but the execution changed. Fewer flights, fewer risks, and far more patience. Each mission had to matter. Each appearance in the sky had to be deliberate. To American pilots, the threat seemed to fade, but it had not disappeared. It had simply become harder to find. And in that uncertainty, the tension returned, quieter than before, but no less dangerous. And yet, the true impact of these encounters would not be measured only in aircraft lost or victories claimed, but in the lessons they forced both sides to confront. Over North Vietnam, one assumption had been quietly dismantled: the belief that technology alone could define the outcome of air combat. The skies had proven otherwise. For the United States, this realization led to a fundamental shift. Training, once focused heavily on long-range interception, began to change. Pilots needed more than advanced systems. They needed instinct, adaptability, and the ability to fight at close range under pressure. Out of this need, a new approach was born, one that emphasized skill as much as machinery. Programs like Top Gun emerged, designed to prepare pilots for the kind of unpredictable, close-quarters engagements that had once been considered obsolete. What had been dismissed as outdated dogfighting, maneuvering, visual combat returned to the center of aerial warfare. The conflict had revealed a simple but lasting truth: no advantage is absolute, and no system is infallible. In the end, it was not just a story of aircraft and tactics, but of adaptation. And in that adaptation, the future of air combat was quietly rewritten.